This is the time for questions, for contributions, and anyone, if you have a question, if you have contributions, you can raise your hand up, then I'll call you to unmute yourself. So while we are waiting for the audience to articulate their questions or contributions, I would like to throw in 2 questions to our speakers. The first one is, Hountondji made a difference between philosophy in Africa and African philosophy. I would appreciate if any one of you could throw more light on this. Then the second question is, if philosophy is purely a rational activity, don't you think we might be having a kind of language problem when it comes to calling ethnophilosophy unanimism? In the sense that the philosophy in ethnophilosophy is a kind of problem, because you can't say that philosophy is critical and still say that philosophy is uncritical at the same time. Please, anyone can answer. Thank you.
I can answer the second one, because the second one speaks directly to what I just tried to do in my presentation. So what the idea is, I mean, obviously, I didn't go into that, but one of the accusation or one of the criticism of Hountondji is that he's pandering towards Eurocentrism, because part of the reason for that, and I think Carmen's presentation does clear up a bit of some of those issues. Part of the reason why that criticism is levied against him is because he seems to adopt a very narrow idea of philosophy, which is philosophy has to be this, rational, rigorous, and all that, scientific and all that. So, and I haven't really engaged with that. I'm saying that even if we accept that philosophy is rational, say, as our people probably will agree with that, the additional move that people like Hountondji makes is that then they want to say that this rational activity can only be the property of an individual mind. So that's why the philosopher can only be an individual, cannot be a community. You can have philosophy in communal philosophy and all that. But precisely that's what I was trying to do in the paper I presented, to say, look, if we already have the idea of extended mind, collective intentionality, group mind, the possibility that you can ascribe the property of thought, of thinking, of rationality to a group, as philosophy of science, philosophy of mind, and cognitive science seems to suggest, then why can communal thinking or communal philosophy not be possible? If you say communal philosophy is communal rationality, communal philosophy being a rational activity, why would that not be possible if we already are talking about possibility of group mind, extended mind, and collective intentionality? So I'm simply working within the parameters of what research in these disciplines are pointing us towards, and I'm saying that if this is correct, if thinking can be ascribed as property beyond just individual mind, it follows therefore that rationality also, as I think, from a form of thinking, can also be ascribed beyond individual mind, therefore to communal mind, therefore to group rationality, and therefore that opens up the possibility of ethnophilosophy as actually philosophy, because one of the reasons for rejecting it in the first place is the idea that you can have philosophy of communal nature, because philosophy has to always be of an individual mind.
Thank you very much, Prof. Please, can any of the speakers answer the first question, please, while we are still waiting for the audience to throw in their questions or contributions? Thank you.
So yeah, honestly, I can't speak in a great amount of detail to this distinction between philosophy in Africa and African philosophy. I mean, I know Hountondji winds up providing this again, relatively narrow definition of African philosophy, but which is supposed to be demythologizing, right? So African philosophy is simply philosophy that's done by people from the African continent. And then the content of that philosophy is left open, right? So that's supposed to open up the possibility that somebody like Hountondji, who is working on, if to the extent that he's working just on Husserl, that also counts as African philosophy. And I think there are, a lot of really interesting responses to that definition. I'm not sure though about the distinction that he draws. That's not something that I'm actually familiar with. So I'm really not the best person to shed light on it. But with respect to this question of philosophy being a purely rational and critical activity, I think everything that Dr. Etiebo has said about this possibility of there being a communal mind is really interesting. And I actually had a follow-up question about the extent to which Hountondji does seem to be interested in the ways that other people, so the way that intersubjectivity is necessary for something like philosophy. So we need other people not only to confirm our thoughts, to kind of verify what we've already come up with on our own, but also, and more substantively, the process of discussion is what leads to universal insight in the first place. So in that sense, I guess I kind of wonder if you think he would be open to these kinds of concepts, right? You hinted that like cognitive science at the time that he was writing hadn't yet developed in this direction. The notion of collective intentionality is particularly interesting to me because of intentionality, the place of intentionality within Husserlian phenomenology, but that's going in a different direction. But yeah, anyway, I was wondering what you think his response to that would be, I guess. I think you're muted still.
Okay, Professor Edwin, please unmute yourself, please.
I didn't know what. Okay, yeah. So I think if we open to the idea, I mean, it does seem to. You say, oh, these are areas that he doesn't know much about, and that would be interesting for what would develop from these newer areas, philosophy of mind, cognitive science, and all that. But of course, he didn't probably have a chance to look more into this sort of material. So to then see would that make him shift a bit of his view. But I do think that even if he accepts that, he might still worry about the worry of unanimism. Might still be something he might still be worried about in terms of he doesn't like the idea of. I mean, people say that all the time. When you say, for example, people actually say you should not be saying African philosophy. When you say African philosophy, you make it look like the whole of Africa. People say the same thing, right? Africa is a diverse place, different cultures, different people. So you should be saying African philosophies, and all that. So it's probably one of those who might be open to the idea of pluralizing African philosophy. So yes, so I would think he should, because again, like you pointed out, given that he's a Husserlian scholar, worked in phenomenology, the idea of intersubjectivity is crucial to phenomenology and all that. But we didn't have a chance to really. I tried to push him, but I mean, there's a limit to how much I push him. In those very short moments of our discussion and all that. But he was nodding. He said, "Okay, interesting. Okay, all right. Okay, I'll have to look into that." So my short answer is yes. I would think that if he had the chance to look at it more, he probably would. He had a bit of a shift in his views about I don't know what that would completely mean. Him accepting ethnophilosophy as proper philosophy, as people like me want to present. He might still have a bit of reservation. But yes, we didn't get to the point where we would know for sure whether he would completely be accepted. I don't know if this answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Edwin, for your response. Please, Arabia, unmute yourself and ask your question or make your contribution. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, our speakers, for all your wonderful contributions. I think my question would speak more to Prof. Edwin, but I think others, including especially Prof. Sanya, can also contribute. So my question is this. So in African philosophy, in regards to this thing of unanimity, there is this idea, especially proposed by Metz, that there exist certain salient features in the cultural worldview of or in African thought that are salient to the continent. All right, and then these sort of ideas can be thought of as, particularly African. All right. But then as an African philosopher, you get the sense that when certain individuals do not philosophize in a way that appeals to these salient features, their ideas run the risk of being labeled un-African. Okay. So my question is, in terms of this idea of unanimity and it being sort of like a yardstick for measuring what counts as African philosophy or not, is there a way out for those in the community who may not share the unanimous view, for instance, who wants to go against the normal, agreed upon salient features that are thought of as the defining features of what makes something African or not? What do we think is the way out of that sort of conundrum?
Very good question, Dr. Arabia. Yes, very good question. I would probably answer your question in a roundabout way. So I'm thinking here, first of all, beginning with the idea of Socrates drank the hemlock poison and he killed himself. And a lot of discussion around Socrates have been, oh, but why would he do that? He could have done something different. He could have ran away, could have, they even wanted him to escape, and blah, 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 and all that. But if you probably you can understand Socrates' behavior within the context of the Greek notion, the specific very notion of virtue. So we talk about virtue ethics today, and the Greeks have a very, very interesting, well worked out idea of virtues, the cardinal virtues, and all that, which in some other cultures may be different and all that. They may be more to the list than for the Greek virtues, or less to the list and all that. But so if you were writing, so I'm using this, like I said, in roundabout way. If you're writing about Greek virtues, for example, you say, I want to write about the ethical necessity of virtues in the Greek or Hellenistic tradition, for example. It will be counted. If you look at a lot of the work in the Aristotelian, Platonic, Hellenistic virtue, they are very specific cardinal virtues, and justice seems to be like, one of the big virtues. Of course, courage is important, and justice seems to be virtues that bring together some other virtues, blah, blah, blah. And then there is the rational prudence, blah, 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 and all that. So supposing you're writing and then you come up and you begin to, you refuse to talk about justice as a virtue, a part of the Greek understanding of virtue. I'm sure people are going to say you are not talking about Greek virtues at all. You're talking about some other kind of virtues, some other virtues from somewhere else. Because to talk about Greek virtues, it's important that one of the cardinal virtues is justice. So that's the same point I want to draw in terms of African philosophy. So when if there are certain things that are salient, like Tad Met has talked about, and then you are coming up with what you call African philosophy, and there is an omission of this salient, what makes it African. When you just say you're not writing about African philosophy, you're writing about something else, your own ideas. The same way we will say that you're not writing about Greek virtues, because you are not talking about. That's why you find that even as philosophers, philosophical that Aristotle is or Plato is, all of them is, you will see that in their discussion of virtue ethics, these cardinal virtues were there. Because as Rousseau has said, people like Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics, his writing was reflecting the Greek experience, or what Greek understood in terms of the moral life or flourishing and all that. So for example, I always tell people, if you're writing about African philosophy, and I will find it very hard, for example, if you don't have a place for the metaphysical concept of ancestors, because ancestors is quite a huge deal, it's a big deal for Africans. It's a big deal. Doesn't matter if you like go and secularize your work, It's a big deal. There's hardly almost any cultural group you go through sub-Saharan Africa that ancestor is not a very big thing for Africans. And for you to have a philosophical work that doesn't take into account the ontology of ancestors, for example, that would, for me, will not be a work in African philosophy. Just as it is the case that if you remove justice from the Greek discussion of virtues, that will not be a work in Greek virtue ethics. I don't know if I answered your question already.
Okay, thank you, Prof, for your response. We still have more time for question or contribution. Please, if you have one, kindly raise your hands up. Okay, Paul Michael, please unmute yourself and ask your question or make your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doc. Thank you. My question goes to Professor Edwin Etivo, and I was particularly struck by by one of the comments we just made now, that if one is writing on African philosophy and one does not highlight something about ancestors, that work is likely not going to be counted as a work in African philosophy. That hits me very hard, because what if I am critiquing an aspect of the social life in Africa, in an African existential reality, and I don't have to talk about ancestors? Does that disqualifies the work from being a work in African philosophy? Just curious, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, thank you. I think, yeah, you're right to ask that question, because my answer probably didn't do enough justice to what I probably wanted to highlight. I wasn't suggesting that every work you do in African philosophy must talk about ancestors. I mean, I was particularly referring to people who write an entire book on African ethics, for example, and they say, look, this book I'm going to write, ancestors have no place at all. So in terms of moral life of the African people, I am writing a secular account of African ethics, not one that takes into account ancestors. And I asked the question, really, can you have an ethical system in Africa without having a place for ancestors, given how important ancestors are metaphysically for Africans, right? You know, so yes, you're right. If you write an article, you're critiquing a particular social practice, for example. I mean, if your work doesn't require you to talk about ancestors, you don't have to talk about ancestors. And there's nothing wrong in that work, in not being called an African work or African philosophy. It's only when you explicitly say that I'm going to give an account, I'm going to give a secular account of African metaphysics, for example. And I say, oh, really? Because ancestors are supposed to be, you know, metaphysical beings that are both sort of, you know, humans and spirits, you know, and all that. So, and people who talk about African metaphysics see ancestors, spirit as one of the concepts that they discuss. So you're going to talk about metaphysics without talking about ancestors, that's essential to African, you know, practices, belief, values, and all that. I would say that that work is not African philosophy, just by the very fact that you've intentionally omitted the place of ancestors in that account. You may as well be you may be talking about a work in German metaphysics. That's what you may as well be doing that, or British metaphysics. You know.
Thank you, Prof. Please, let's keep our questions very brief and our responses also very brief. Professor Sanya, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sorry, thank you. I just wanted to respond to Arabia's question, which was because he mentioned me, wanted me to. It's a very interesting question, because I think it speaks to the tensions of doing philosophy in modern Africa. But what we've seen, I don't think it's the question of how to prescribe one single way, because I mean we're talking of a multiplicity of voices, of our approaches. Some will see unanimism as something positive, or construed as of having some sort of African provenance, African significance, and so it should be included in what they do. others would, like Hountondji, would say that it's something to be done away with. But I think the plurality of voices, the plurality of approaches speaks to the dynamism and energy to be found in the field. The field is quite interesting. There's a lot of new topics. There are lots of new discussions going on. And I think it speaks. It's a healthy attribute. Whatever approach one takes, that's an individual matter. I think. So that's how I'd respond to David. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Thank you. Costa, please unmute yourself and ask your question or make your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you again to the speakers. Can one of the speakers maybe comment on whether Hountondjian position would allow for African cinema as a mode of African philosophy?
Okay, please,
Kama,
can you the
you
speakers
want to?
answer?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. I do kind of the last bit of the paper that I presented, I think I'm just being more suggestive there about what we ultimately get from Hountondji's meta philosophy. But I do think we wind up with something relatively expansive, right? The real constraint is criticality for him, as I understand it. So I could certainly see cinema being a source in the way that he thinks about all sorts of endogenous resources, being like background, source material, etc. This more radical point where I think he's kind of pushing like what we're considering philosophy in the first place, right? It might not even have to be a written text anymore, which comes through very strongly in the early critique of ethnophilosophy, that it's much more stringent what counts as philosophical. I think in the later work he more or less abandons that. So I do think there is material for an affirmative Hountondjian response to your question. That being said, I will also acknowledge that I think that's a probably controversial interpretation of Hountondji's position, but I think certainly in the later work there is material to answer in that way. Yeah, thank you for the question. It's an interesting one. It's not something I've actually thought about, so.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kaman. Is there any of the speakers that still want to say something on this question?
I think Kama did explain it very well. I think so.
So we still have a few minutes. Any other question or contribution? Okay, maybe we'll be rounding off with this question. I'm putting this to our three speakers. It's going to be very brief. It has been argued that African philosophy is a male-dominated field. And I'm thinking, how can Hountondji's indigenous knowledge foster more participation of women in African philosophy? Thank you.
Dr. Osha, you want to take that question?
The question of the preponderance of men in philosophy is not an African problem alone. I think it's worldwide. Generally, men tend to, I don't know, for whatever reason, be engaged in philosophy more, sort of, and then perhaps a lot of the work women do isn't properly projected. I think they work in different spaces. I think also we have perhaps a very narrow understanding of philosophy as well. It's very male defined, and so I mean, and the spaces in which we look for what we regard as philosophy are male spaces. But I'm sure if we look or if we have a different kind of conception, if we and we factor in other questions like gender, and look in other spaces, feminist oriented space, I'm sure we'd find philosophical thought. I think so. As it's just the way we define philosophy and where we look for it. So that's why perhaps it's if we unlearn the way we think about philosophy as a largely male-oriented discipline, then I'm sure we would have other orientations and voices and what traditions. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, just very briefly, I mean, I agree with everything that Professor Osha just said, but I also, there's a very interesting paper of Hountondji's, which is called Tradition, Hindrance, or Inspiration, and there he speaks about the necessity of engaging not just the margin, but what he calls the margin of the margin. And he speaks particularly about the status of women in pre-colonial thought systems. And he doesn't develop this idea much, but I think there is a thread to be pulled there that, you know, can kind of recruit Hountondji for a more gender inclusive future of philosophy. Again, not just a necessity in Africa, but a necessity everywhere in the world, right? Gender exclusion is a global problem, but I do think that's something that he speaks to with this margin of the margin language. Yeah, it's a great question.
Thank you so much. Arabia, please unmute yourself and ask your question or make your contribution. Please, this will be the last question or contribution before we end the meeting. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Amara. But my question is for Professor Carmen. So part of Hountondji's thinking is that criticality and analytic rigor, so to say, is very crucial in doing philosophy. But for me, there seems to be a problem when that rigor is now focused on certain aspects of African philosophy, especially in metaphysics. So Professor Eteibe was talking about ancestors, for instance. So suppose I, for instance, employ scientific critical rigor on that concept and begin to dismantle it and begin to make claims about its non-viability, for instance. The idea might be that doing that might undermine the sort of like the core of the cultural worldview, for instance. So I guess my question is, how do we create a balance between, you know, this critical rigor and then sustaining some of these ideas that seem to be or appear to be extremely crucial to what it means for African philosophy, what African philosophy actually means. So how do we balance that sort of tension? Because it appears to exist. I don't know, I might be wrong.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and it's a great question. I hope this isn't hedging, but here's an answer I want to try, which is that I think ultimately, and especially in the later work with the project of reappropriating endogenous knowledge, the emphasis on criticality and rigor really is turned towards the philosopher themselves or the investigator themselves. So rather than having this demand of criticism, rigor be oriented towards the knowledge systems that you're dealing with, even though it is also there, there's a kind of self-criticism about the philosopher's own presuppositions, right? And there you kind of see the influence of Husserl too, where the aim of phenomenology would be presuppositionless thinking. So what that would mean is questioning your own presuppositions about the viability of something like a metaphysics, which has a really profound role for ancestors, right? So the kind of assumption that that can't be viable, that can't be admissible as a philosophy has to be questioned. And I think there you kind of, again, like get a much more radical vision of what you can actually include within the bounds of philosophy if you take criticality to mean first and foremost self-criticism, I think, and you really do get that emphasis in the later Hountondji's work, but I think it's already there in the critique of ethnophilosophy. So That's my best my best attempt at answering that question. But I think you're right that there really is a challenge there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kamen. Sorry, Arabia, we don't have more time for follow-up. Thank you to all our speakers. Thank you for your insightful, thought-provoking lecture. Thank you for being here. And thank you to all our participants. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your comments and your contributions. And thank you for, my thanks also goes to the Center for Phenomenology in South Africa and the Conversational School of Philosophy for organizing this tribute roundtable for Paulin J. May his soul rest in peace, and let the conversation be continue, and let the conversation and discussions continue after this meeting. Thank you so much. Thank you for